In 1588, Spain launched the most powerful naval fleet ever assembled. 130 warships, 30,000 men, the undisputed superpower of the known world. Within 2 years, the empire was bankrupt. Not from the battle they lost, from the debt they accumulated trying to stay on top. That same sequence has destroyed every dominant power of the last 5 centuries. And the United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. If you want to understand where this pattern leads and how to position yourself before the final stages arrive, subscribe to the Econaut. We map economic history onto the present so you can see what's coming before it arrives. 3 empires, 3 complete collapses, all following the identical sequence, separated by centuries, connected by the same fatal decisions. Spain in the 1600s, Britain in the 1900s, the Soviet Union in 1991. Each believed their power was permanent, each was wrong, and each left behind a blueprint that the United States is now following, stage by stage, almost without deviation. Imperial collapse never begins with military defeat or foreign invasion. It begins with economic exhaustion. The empire expands faster than its capacity to sustain that expansion. Military commitments multiply, debts accumulate, promises pile up that the treasury cannot honor. In the early stages, nothing looks wrong. The currency still circulates, the military still wins engagements, the government still makes guarantees. But underneath the surface, the structural cracks are spreading. Capital gets misallocated, productive capacity erodes. The most talented people leave for places still ascending. Then the acceleration begins. Allies start hedging their bets. Rivals probe the boundaries. Trading partners quietly seek alternatives. And the very advantages that built the empire, currency dominance, military reach, financial credibility, begin reversing into vulnerabilities. That's the pattern, not a theory. A documented sequence that has repeated 3 times in the last 500 years. Spain, 1500s to 1600s. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain became the first truly global power. They seized control of the most productive silver mines in human history. By 1550, Spanish galleons were delivering 200 tons of silver annually to European ports. By 1600, over 400 tons per year. Spain didn't just participate in the global economy, they controlled the money supply of the entire Western world. The Spanish real was the reserve currency every merchant, every bank, every government needed to hold. And here is where the pattern always begins. A nation that controls the world's money starts to believe that control is permanent. King Philip II commanded more wealth than any monarch in history, and he deployed it on empire simultaneously in every direction. Wars against the Ottomans, wars against France, wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands that dragged on for 80 years, wars against England's navy, military campaigns in the Philippines and throughout the Americas. By 1580, Spain was maintaining active military commitments across 4 continents. Half of all royal revenue went to military expenditure. And still, it wasn't enough. So they did what every overextended empire does when the bills exceed the income. They debased the currency. Spanish coins that were supposed to be pure silver began containing copper. First 10%, then 25%, then 50%. The face value remained unchanged while the real value collapsed. By 1600, coins officially called silver contained barely any. Merchants stopped accepting them at stated value. Prices exploded, and still the spending continued, now financed through debt. Spain borrowed from Italian bankers, German bankers, anyone willing to lend against future silver shipments. By 1557, less than 20 years into Philip's reign, Spain declared its first bankruptcy, then borrowed again, went bankrupt again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 complete sovereign defaults in 40 years. Each time, officials promised fiscal discipline. Each time, the spending resumed and the borrowing accelerated. What followed illustrates perhaps the most counterintuitive dynamic in economic history. Spain had access to unlimited silver, and it destroyed them. When a nation can import everything, it stops producing anything. Why cultivate farmland when food can be purchased? Why develop manufacturing when finished goods can be bought? Why innovate when silver can substitute for ingenuity? Spanish nobility considered manual labor and commerce beneath their dignity. The merchant class that drives economic development never emerged the way it did in England or the Netherlands. Manufacturing stagnated. Agriculture contracted. The silver that arrived from the Americas immediately departed to pay for French wine, Italian textiles, Dutch machinery. Spain became an economic pipeline. Wealth flowed through them, but never accumulated. When the silver mines began declining, there was nothing underneath to sustain the structure. The entire system depended on a single resource, and when that resource faltered, the empire followed. By 1640, Portugal had broken away. By 1650, the Netherlands, Spain's most productive territory, was gone. By 1700, the empire that had dominated the world a century earlier was a hollow shell, large in geographic terms, economically irrelevant, from undisputed global superpower to secondary regional power in under 100 years. And they never reversed that trajectory. Spain today is a pleasant country with a rich cultural heritage and minimal influence on global affairs. The civilization that conquered 2 continents is now primarily known as a tourist destination. That is the endpoint of imperial collapse. Britain, 1900. At its apex, the British Empire administered 25% of the world's land surface and governed 400 million people. The pound sterling was the currency the entire global trading system ran on. Every major commercial contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British government bonds as primary reserves. And just as Spain had believed 4 centuries earlier, the British establishment was convinced this arrangement was permanent. Britain's military commitments by 1900 spanned 6 continents. India required permanent occupation forces. Africa demanded constant policing. The Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean, all required naval presence and ground forces. The cost of maintaining an empire that size was already straining the treasury. Then, 1914 arrived. Stay neutral while European powers destroyed each other, or enter the war and risk the financial foundations of the empire. They entered the war. World War I cost Britain the equivalent of $1 trillion in today's purchasing power. They liquidated foreign investments, sold assets accumulated over 2 centuries, and borrowed heavily, primarily from the United States. The creditor nation of the world had become a debtor nation. The pound sterling was supposed to be backed by gold, but the war had drained Britain's gold reserves. Vast quantities had been shipped to America in exchange for weapons, food, and supplies. Rather than acknowledge this reality, Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate, a rate that no longer reflected the actual state of British finances. British exports became too expensive for foreign buyers. Manufacturing contracted, unemployment climbed. By 1931, the position became untenable. Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pound lost 25% of its value in a single announcement. The currency that every nation on earth had trusted as the anchor of the global trading system had just admitted it could no longer keep its fundamental promise. Then came the Second World War. Another $120 billion in costs, more borrowing from America. By 1945, British external debt exceeded the entire annual output of the British economy. The war was won. The empire was finished. India, the crown jewel, the source of British wealth for 2 centuries, achieved independence in 1947. Over the following 2 decades, the rest followed. Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books. The pound continued its long decline, from $4 in 1940 to $2 by 1980 to roughly $1.20 today. The global reserve currency became a regional currency. The Soviet Union, 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the USSR stood alongside America as one of only 2 genuine superpowers. Nuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization, the largest conventional military on Earth. Political control over Eastern Europe, the first satellites in space. For 4 decades, they competed with America across every dimension. But underneath the ideological confidence, the economic reality was deteriorating steadily. The Soviet Union was allocating 15 to 20% of its entire economic output to military spending, 3 times the American ratio, while operating an economy roughly half the size. They were matching American military capability with an economy structurally incapable of sustaining that competition indefinitely. The civilian economy was failing in ways the official statistics concealed. Soviet factories produced goods nobody wanted. Soviet farms, operating some of the most fertile land on Earth, couldn't generate sufficient food. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain, an agricultural superpower dependent on foreign food suppliers. The ruble was never a credible international currency. Soviet citizens preferred dollars when they could obtain them. The USSR had to pay for essential imports with gold reserves and oil revenues, because its currency commanded no confidence outside its borders. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the revenue stream masking the structural failures disappeared. Gold reserves were depleting. The government was running out of hard assets. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not because of military defeat or foreign intervention, but because the Soviet government could no longer afford to prevent it. Eastern European populations simply walked away, and Moscow lacked the economic resources to respond. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany. The entire buffer of satellite states vanished within a single year. On December 26, 1991, exactly 900 days after the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. No invasion, no military defeat, no external enemy. A superpower possessing 30,000 nuclear weapons dissolved from internal economic failure. 3 empires, 3 identical sequences. 3 complete destructions of what each believed was permanent power. Now examine the United States through the same framework. Military overextension. Over 750 military installations across 80 countries. Personnel deployed in more than 150 nations. Annual defense budget exceeding $850 billion, more than the combined military spending of the next 10 countries. Equipment aging faster than replacement cycles allow. Recruitment consistently below targets. Commitments to defend Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Middle East that cannot all be honored simultaneously if multiple crises emerge at once. The overextension is not theoretical, it's operational. Currency debasement. In 1971, the United States severed the dollar's connection to gold. Since that moment, the money supply has expanded without constraint. Since 2000, the monetary base has increased by approximately 400%. Since 2020 alone, over $6 trillion were created in a 3-year period. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. The mechanism differs from Spain's copper-silver dilution. The economic consequence is identical. Debt spiral. Total federal debt has crossed $39 trillion, approximately 134% of annual economic output. Annual interest payments approaching $1 trillion. Annual deficits continuing regardless of economic conditions, including $1.8 trillion during a period of expansion. The government borrows to pay interest on previous borrowing. This is not approaching a debt spiral, it is one. Loss of productive capacity. American manufacturing as a share of economic output has declined steadily for 50 years. The trade deficit runs at approximately $800 billion annually. Supply chains for pharmaceuticals, electronics, steel, and military hardware components run through foreign countries. The structural dependency on imports that preceded Spain's collapse is visible in American economic data. Social fragmentation. Institutional trust across every category, government, media, judiciary, financial system, sits at historic lows. Drug overdose deaths exceed 100,000 annually. Political dysfunction has made basic governance increasingly difficult. The social cohesion of earlier periods has fractured along multiple lines simultaneously. 5 stages completed. Stage 6 is reserve currency erosion, the point at which allied nations begin diversifying away from dollar dependence, when trade begins settling in alternative currencies, when the dollar begins returning home because foreign demand has diminished. The evidence of early stage 6 dynamics is already present. BRICS nations are actively constructing alternative payment architectures. Central banks globally have been accumulating gold at the fastest pace in decades. China and Russia have shifted bilateral trade to their own currencies. Saudi Arabia has accepted yuan for oil transactions, a development that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. The transition from Stage 5 to Stage 6 is not a sudden event. It's a gradual shift in confidence. in the decisions of thousands of institutions simultaneously adjusting their assumptions about which currency constitutes reliable value storage. Stage 7 is the endpoint. Not gradual managed decline, but rapid systemic failure. The Soviet Union's transition from superpower to non-existent took 900 days. Britain's loss of empire took 20 years. Spain's collapse extended over a generation. But in each case, when the terminal phase arrived, it moved faster than observers anticipated. The mechanism is always the same. Reserve currency failure triggers debt crisis. Debt crisis triggers government dysfunction. Government dysfunction triggers loss of the military capacity that sustains reserve currency status. The interdependencies collapse together. Every empire that reached stage 5 believed it remained exceptional. Spain believed the silver would continue. Britain believed the empire's scale made it irreplaceable. The Soviet Union believed ideological momentum would overcome economic gravity. The pattern doesn't negotiate with exceptionalism. It operates on mathematics. An economy growing at 2% annually cannot indefinitely service debt expanding at 8% annually. Manufacturing dependence cannot be rebuilt quickly once the industrial base has been transferred offshore over decades. Currency credibility, once genuinely questioned by international actors, has never been restored without fundamental restructuring. The 3 historical examples don't predict the exact form American decline will take or specify the timeline with precision. What they establish, with the clarity that 3 repeated examples provide, is the sequence of events and their logical interconnection. The question isn't whether the pattern applies. The question is where within the pattern we currently sit, and how much time remains before the later stages become undeniable. 3 civilizations believed they had built something permanent enough to escape what had consumed every previous empire. History recorded their confidence and their collapse with equal dispassion. The answers to what comes next aren't hidden in speculation about the future. They're documented in the historical record, written by the civilizations that experienced what we are now entering. Subscribe to the Econaut, and we'll examine those records together, because understanding the sequence is the first step toward positioning for what the sequence produces.